So before we begin, by show of hands, how many of you have heard of predatory publishing before? Great. And have any of you ever been contacted for predatory publishing? Okay. So today we're going to learn about what it is and how to avoid being exploited. So what is predatory publishing? It's an exploitative practice that targets authors to submit articles to a journal without providing the editorial or publishing services associated with legitimate journals. It can also include being contacted to serve on the editorial board, and it can also include being contacted for predatory conferences. And an important distinction to note is that it's not all open access journals. So here you can see the rise of predatory publishing. So this is from 2010 to 2014. The red bar is the overall development. And in 2010, there was between 150 to 2,000. And then by 2014, it was about 8,000 predatory open access journals. And some updated figures. Before Bell's list went dark, there was about 1,000 publishers he identified, plus 900 journals of predatory nature in 2016. So it just continues to develop. And so because it's on the rise, why else should you care? Basically because it's a scam. So it's this push, with the push for research and publications, in lots of fields, it's important to take the time to submit to the right journal. If you accidentally submit to one of these, it's going to be a lot of risk to you. It's going to be a lot of waste of time, waste of money. The frustrations of dealing with this embarrassment from being published in here and, and falling for a scam, and then having to try and get your work published in a legitimate journal, which you can kind of be dinged for, wasting a publication on a predatory one in the first place. And then here's the distribution of predatory open access articles in 2014. So in the biomedicine field, there was about 75,000. And then engineering has almost 100,000, general 160,000. And this was just in 2014. So you can see it's on the rise, and this is what predatory publishing and their characteristics. So I mentioned before, you're solicited for an article or asked to serve on editorial boards. There's usually high fees associated with it. With the lack of editorial services, there's usually also no or little peer review of your submitted articles. And this is also an issue because you're not giving it to other experts in the field to verify your work, to double check it, to improve your research. So you're not growing. They also imitate legitimate journals, so they'll create fake websites. They generally have very similar names to well-established journals or publishers. They create fake academic members to serve on their editorial board. So they either get people to fall for their scam, or they just grab people and add it without their knowledge. They also sometimes provide a fake address, sometimes no address at all. And a quick Google Maps search can prove that. They create fake metrics like their impact factor, or they use other made-up types of journal metrics. And then besides the high author fee just to get accepted, they also charge you another fee to redact the article. So there's numerous ways to identify, and I'll go through those after this. The first thing you can always do if you don't have time or the expertise is you consult with a librarian, such as myself. You just can either forward that email you get from the publisher, or you can, say, oh, I was looking at this. Is this predatory? Should I watch out for it? You can also do the research yourself, and I'll show you some things to look out for. And then as you're doing that research, you want to ask yourself, do I want to publish here? I mean, if it looks kind of fishy and it's raising red flags, that may be enough for you. And then some other things to look at is how long has it been established. You want to be wary of things that just kind of pop up. That's not to say that newly established journals and publishers are bad. It's just that's also a red flag. And Bell's list went dark in January of 2017. So if they're already on the archive version, you can check there. You can also talk to your peers to see if they've ever heard of the journal or conference, or you can just do a quick Google search for other complaints or questions. Usually if you put in like journal name scam, you'll get some hits from forums, people asking about this sort of stuff.
Adrian?
Yes?
Why did Bell's list go dark?
I will cover that later, but it's because he was threatened and, you know, like politics of listing these. So he did the research himself. It's his opinions that these are predatory publishers. They came after him. They threatened to sue. You know, his university didn't want to deal with that. And there was also some questions about how accurate his list was because it was his research. You know, it's up to every researcher to select to publish or not in a specific journal or with a publisher. Okay, so if you want to start researching the journal, there's a few things you want to look at. You want to take out the email they sent you. Then you want to take out their website, and you want to check out their publisher's website. So to begin with their email, the first thing a lot of these have in common is they have a lot of spelling and grammatical errors. So, you know, they don't take the time to proofread, or they're not natural English language speakers. So they're using something like Google Translate, and it just doesn't make any sense to people who work professionally in English. They also like to use excessive flattery. Sometimes they get your name incorrect. They'll either just put a random they'll put like dear and then leave it blank. They'll do dear doctor and then put your last name in all caps. They'll do a general greeting like dear Dr. Author or dear Dr. Researcher. So they don't know who you are. They're just kind of throwing this out to as many people as possible. They're overly positive about the journal, and they usually have a urgency in the request to get their hands on your work and money. And then another thing, I haven't seen this myself, but the email address could also be from a general account like using @Gmail or @Yahoo. So here's a sample email, and I highlighted some of the things. So you can see dear author, that's just a very general greeting. Then they also start being really nice in the beginning, that the hope our email finds you well and in a healthy mood. And then they move on to their extreme flattery. You're an experienced personality. You're absolutely prominent. You can also be called esteemed, brilliant, magnificent, the leader in the field. Not to say that you're not, but you know, they really lay on the compliments. And then the next sentence is all the different types of journal articles that they accept. So, you know, journals, they have multiple types of articles they accept, but the more they have, you know, it's kind of a red flag, like that they just take whatever. Then they try to ensure that it's not spam by putting this is not a spam message. And then they close out with more flattery and some odd endings like lasting scientific relationship for the benefit of scientific community. And if you read this, you know, it doesn't really make that much sense. This isn't real, this is fake, I made this up.
Do you recommend doing the reply to opt out or just ignore it?
I would just ignore it because they're spamming people. Another thing they do is when they note how important they are, they'll put something like, you know, we have 900,000 subscribers or something like that. They don't usually identify that.
And I've gotten similar emails inviting me to present my work.
Those are predatory conferences. At least that's what it sounds like. Oh, and then they also use an excessive number of explanation points, which I didn't put in this example. Oh, and then, yeah, be wary of launching issues or invitations to submit your work by email address. Okay, so that's the initial communication. If you look at that email and you want to go on to looking at their website, there's a few different areas you can look at. Well, the first thing is the aims of scope of the journal. So generally, legitimate journals, they'll have a descriptive and clear definition of the material that's included. They generally list between 1 to 2 categories. And recent research that I based some of these on, they have 1 to 2 categories with a range of 1 to 16, while predatory publishers have 1 to 4 categories with a range of 1 to 31. So, you know, they just try to include as many topics as possible. And they'll also be really vague, like we're on dentistry. But I mean, there are journals just on dentistry, so, but they kind of like focus in as well. And then the next thing is the journal name itself. Is it really similar to a well-established journal? In the one example I want to have you do for a hands-on exercise, I mean, it looks so simple, like you can just see by looking at it. And then the next thing to check out is indexing. So well-established journals will be indexed in lots of different databases. Generally, for medicine and some sciences, it's Medline. And then there's lots of different EBSCO databases, ProQuest, CINAHL, Sports Discus, Scopus, Web of Science, things like that. They'll list, you know, some of them can list like 50 different databases that they're in. If they're open access, they could also be in the directory of open access journals. But so if you take a look at the indexing and you've never heard of any of those, or they only have like 3, that may also be an indicator that it's fake. And then another thing to look out for is how easy is it to establish who the publisher is. Legitimate journals, the publisher information is usually in the header, it's in the footer, they list, you know, they list it somewhere within the website. If you can't easily identify who the publisher is, if they don't give a link to the publisher, that's another red flag. The contact information, generally they'll have some sort of email address, they'll have a web form, they'll list their mailing location. If you only have a web form and like no contact information, that's another red flag. And if they do list an address, you want to put it in Google Maps. I've checked on journals before, put in the address, and it was to a random shopping center in Las Vegas. So, you know, does it look like a publisher would actually be in that building? The journal metrics. So there's lots of different types of journal metrics. Impact factor is a big one. The legitimate journals use metrics like impact factor, SciMogo rating, an overall ranking, a 5-year impact factor, or EGen factor, while fake metrics are an index Copernicus value, global impact factor, scientific journal impact factor, total citations, or scientific journal rankings, or like a Google Scholar ranking as well. And those, or they can just straight make up impact factors that aren't easily verified. The next one is staff. So you want to look at their editorial board, and I'll go in more detail in a few slides. And then the website in general, who is it aimed at? Is it aimed at authors? Does it have lots of links to submit your publication, or, you know, total citations, or look at how many times this one article was cited, you know, or is it aimed to the reader to get people interested in actually learning what's in the journal? And then the other thing is image quality. Is it a nice sharp image, or is it blurry or stretched weird, or, you know, something that they just kind of grabbed from another source and threw on there? So that's looking at the website. And then there's a few other things. The submission method. So generally, legitimate journals will have you use either third party. They're like portals that you have to log into and upload your paper, and then that's how you do the peer review and go through their process. They may have a journal-specific one where Predatory Publishing, they could have that, or they can just ask you to email the article, which is another red flag. And then policies for the journal or the publisher should also be clearly outlined. You know, what's their copyright policy? Legitimate journals, the traditional ones where you have a subscription, the publisher holds the copyright. Open access articles, the author holds the copyright. If that's not mentioned at all, that's a red flag. Is there a retraction policy? You know, and what about preservation? So with predatory journals, they just kind of pop up overnight. So you may have your article on their site for a few months, but then if they just stop, you know, doing the scam, then it's going to disappear and you're going to lose, you know, access to your work. And they usually have a preservation policy as well. And then those wonderful fees. They have really, so this is weird. Their fees can be either really low, which is like too good to be true, or they can be really high. So with traditional journals for subscription, all the fees are covered by the publisher. For open access, it's covered by the author. So just because there is a fee doesn't mean it's predatory. It just means that it's open access. So sometimes they'll say, you know, before we even make a decision, you have to pay us $1,000, or do they even explain their fees? Those policies are usually outlined on the journal site. And then I mentioned before that if you discover it's predatory and you want to take your article out, there's additional fees for that. And always remember that their goal is to make money. They don't care about advancing research or science or the general knowledge. They just want to make a quick buck. And then some editorial services. You should expect a certain level of professionalism and support from legitimate journals. I mentioned before that sometimes they have no peer review process. They also usually promise rapid publication. So, you know, they'll say, like, if you give us this article, it will be published in the next 30 days. Legitimate journals, it takes a lot longer. They can have preprints, which can appear quicker, but usually it could be a few weeks or a few months until your article is actually in an issue. I mentioned before, if they have a large variety of article formats, that's a red flag. And then for the editorial board, you want to take a look at those. Are these people well known in your fields? Do they provide their affiliation? Is it easy to verify that these people are on their memberships? Do the members themselves provide links to the journal on if they have like a professional website or something with their institution of a profile? Do they mention it, or do they just slap these names on the editorial board? And then the last part is researching the publisher. So I mentioned before that it should be easy to identify who the publisher is. And once you know who the publisher is, do they provide a link to the publisher, or do you have to go to Google and find that publisher website? That's another red flag. And then do they also participate in some sort of ethics? So there's COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. A lot of open access journals are member of this association. So are they a part of that or another one? And then does the publisher also provide contact information, or you just use a web form?
If they're a member of COPE or some other organization committee, would it say it on their website, or do you have to look for that?
They usually like to advertise that like front and center. I mean, they can grab fake graphics that just say open access, but the one I looked at, like it was front and center, COPE member since 2011. They give a link to that. Later, if you keep digging, they expand on that. But they'll have a little badge usually to indicate that. Okay. So that's a lot of information. That's different ways you can check and figure out, am I being scammed? Is this a predatory journal or publisher? And then you make your decision if you want to go forward or you just ignore it. Or you can do some initial research, talk to your peers, do a quick Google search, and then send it to the library to verify your findings, or just forget about it. So there are risks. So I mentioned before the high author fees, the subpar peer review, you're not improving yourself. Because these are fly-by-night operations, you may have low visibility, or it's difficult to find because they're not indexed in big databases like the different EBSCO or PubMed, Web of Science. Your article could disappear. So, if they get enough money and then they stop their operation, it's gone from the internet and no one will be able to find it. And remember that they're seeking profit over value of knowledge, and then you also have to deal with the embarrassment from the scam, which no one likes to be scammed. Yes?
So, say I submitted an article and I found out afterwards that there was a scam, and I wanted to submit it to a reputable journal, but I already, so you have to disclose if you submitted this work to another journal. How would I handle that?
Well, so you would have to, I think you get it redacted, and then you kind of just explain to them like you didn't realize this was a predatory journal, and then I've never had anyone deal with that. So, but you just kind of explain to them your situation, and then they might accept it.
Right. That's why I'm wondering, but I have to redact it before I could submit it. If they're a scam, if it's not a legitimate journal, if I really published it.
That probably varies by journal to journal.
Yeah, if you can't find it, but it's your own ethics, right? That you do it just, a legitimate journal, and you have to verify that you're not submitting it elsewhere.
Any?
Complicated.
Yeah. Okay.
So just don't.
So that's all about predatory publishing. The other thing I advertised was the difference between open access. Oh, and here's more information about Bell's list. So he was a librarian from the University of Colorado. He was putting together that list on a blog for a few years. He was an open critic of open access publishing. He did a lot of, he did write some about predatory publishing, kind of warning people and getting, that topic out. His blog went dark in 2017. I happened to discover it because I went to go use it and it was gone. Luckily, there's still archived versions available. Some of them, they're not maintained, so that information can go out of date. But it's still a good place just to check to look for this information. Okay. Does anyone have any other questions before I move on to open access? So I mentioned in the beginning that predatory publishing is not open access. Open access is the free immediate online availability of research articles. So it's just getting access to more people because subscriptions to journals can be costly. And the fee is to the author instead of the publisher. So here's some benefits of open access. There's increased visibility because more people can get to the full text. It drives innovation. It increases citation rates because more people can get to the full text, and then there's the global impact of sharing research and knowledge. So here's the differences between open access and traditional. I've kind of mentioned this. So that open access, it's covered by the author, and traditional, it's covered by the publisher. The material is free to access to the public, where traditional you need subscriptions or you need to purchase one individual article, and that can range from like $50 to $100 per article, and it can be thousands of dollars for a subscription. And open access has less barriers for reuse. They usually have open licenses like the Creative Commons, but you still need to attribute where you get your information from. It's not just like free, whatever you want to do with it, you still have to attribute. And with traditional, copyrights held by the publisher, and that requires permission to reuse, distribute, modify, commercial reuse, etc. Open access has the benefit of getting publications out quicker. Most of them are online, and I mentioned before, traditional journals, it can take a lot longer. You know, there could be a few weeks for just a decision if you're accepted, and you have to go through the peer review process and all their hurdles, and then it could take months for it to be an issue. And here are some misconceptions. It is peer-reviewed. The type of the gold open access, they use the peer review process. The quality of research is lower. That's not necessarily true. It's just that the author rather hold onto the copyright and give access to more people. It's not free. It's just that the author pays for those fees, but it's free for the users. I said before, there's that you can't just do whatever you want with it. Sometimes there is copyright. It's held by the author, but they generally allow you to use the work. And I mentioned before, just because you have to pay doesn't mean it's predatory publishing. It just means it's open access. And low discoverability, that's not true because large open access journals are still indexed in well-known databases like PubMed, Web of Science, Scopus, etc. And here there are two different types of open access. The most well-known one and what most people think of is the gold one. So these are peer-reviewed, they're easy to find, and the authors retain copyright, and they're in like an individual journal, like the PLOS, and then Elsevier has some, Springer, Wiley, and then the green, it's not an individual journal, it's a repository, so they'll just link it for free. They don't do the peer review process, you usually do that through a third party. And sometimes it's open access, but you only get a preprint or postprint or both. So those are two different types of open access. And then it's always important to remember your rights as an author. So with open access, you retain the copyright. So that means you get to decide, you know, how's it being published, who can access it, how can it get distributed, you know, who can modify your work, how much, you know, all that sort of stuff. If you want to get fees to do copyright, you can do that. And then you can learn more at the SPARC author addendum, which is a link at the end of these slides. Let me just take a sip of water.
While you're taking this, just if you're publishing
publishing a research article for NIH or NSF or any other federal agencies, they're required to make it open access to the public. A lot of journals have made that free. It's not always free, but it's often free. You can also deposit it in the NIH depository, NSF as well, yourself, and then it's also free. It's a requirement. So I think that's where open access got its start.
Yeah, the NIH policy is that all NIH grants require open access of the publication within 12 months. And then they also require research data management plan and a bunch of other stuff. But yeah, and the other organizations that you mentioned. Okay, so there's predatory journals and there's predatory conferences. So it's a conference that just, it seems too good to be true. They have a few characteristics. They're very similar to predatory publishing as well. And they are listed here. So one of the big things is it's usually in a wonderful location. It's usually international if you want to go to Hong Kong or Berlin. They advertise that it's a great vacation destination, things like that. The communication is similar. They're overly positive about their conference. They like to flatter you a lot, and they also have grammatical and spelling errors as well. They oversell their conference, like predatory publishing oversells their journals. The same issues with distorted images or an unprofessional website. Another thing they do is they usually give you an invitation to a conference that's not in your field. So if I were to be invited to an engineering conference, it wouldn't make any sense. Another thing, a lot of conferences have conference proceedings that they publish. So if those aren't available, if they're not in WorldCat or they're not available to libraries, that's another red flag. If your peers have never heard of this conference, that's another red flag. If it isn't easy to figure out how many past conferences they had, if they give it a vague title saying that's like the third one, but you can't find information from the first two, that's another red flag. Generally, you can get to past conferences for like a year or two. So if you can't get to any, that's an issue. They have a really broad theme. So if there's a conference on medicine, it's kind of broad.
I got one where it was like engineering, science, and medicine. It's like,
yeah.
You cover all that.
Yeah. And then the last thing is pay to play. So if they say, the regular registration fee is $1,000, but if you want to speak, moderate, or chair a panel, then it's $1,500. That's another issue. And if you never heard of the organizer or the publisher putting it on, usually it's well-known professional societies putting on these conferences. So with the predatory conferences, you can do the same research, check their email, check the website, check the organization's website. You can ask the library for help. You can talk to your peers and just kind of follow your gut with this as well. Okay, so now we're going to do a hands-on exercise. Does everyone have a laptop or can share? Okay, so I have a handout to help guide you. You don't have to fill out all of it. There's just some spots to help, look from some stuff. So if you I put in the website, which I know can be difficult to type out, but these are two ones that you can take a look at to see. This first one is I also reviewed, and the second one was one that I was contacted about to review. for someone here. So the first thing is the journal name, Clinical Reviews and Opinions. It's a really vague journal title. I mean, there are others out there, but this can blend in so well to other types of journals out there. And then just landing on their homepage, you'll notice that, here they have their instruction for authors. Right under their quick links, they have submit your manuscript, track your manuscript. They let you know their most shared articles right here. So, they're really pushing this to authors, They make it easy for you to give them your manuscripts. And then they're like, look at how great we are. Look at how much we've been shared. So that's another thing. So that's the front page. And then digging in a little more, if you look at abstracting and indexing, here you only have 4 databases that they're indexed in. I haven't heard of the first 3. WorldCat is it's not a database like PubMed, it's a database of where libraries put in their holdings. So you can put in lots of different books or movies or, different types of media, and then you can search, and depending on the resource, you can find all the metadata about it. You can find the table of contents if it's a book, and then they also link you to nearby libraries that also have it. So being indexed in WorldCat isn't really anything because it's easy to be in WorldCat. So these are terrible indexing. And then going to the authors and then instructions for authors. So, they give you a little guidance on all these different areas, but if you scroll through and read through it, it's really vague. If you go to other journals, they're really detailed. They don't just give you a sentence. This one, their research ethics, so they say that you should follow it. It may be in another spot, and then they also say they subscribe to the COPE ideas, but they're not a member. So they would say if they were a member or not. And, and they just briefly outline, the title phrase should be brief. That's not really, you just look at this and it doesn't make much sense. And then when I don't remember where it was, but I tried to click on their third-party submission process, and it led me to a dead link. And then they make it really easy to join their editorial board.
I was looking at the editorial team, and can you click on that?
Oh yeah, they're editors.
Interesting.
They have
2 editors.
So I did a Google search on both of them to see if you can verify. This first one, I found, or the second one, sorry, I found his ResearchGate page, but there's no mention of this journal, and it also has them somewhere else. And then the first one seems to be a really common name. There was a lot of different doctors within the Phoenix area with that name, so that doesn't really help either.
But usually you don't put doctor, but your actual
Yeah, you put MD or PhD.
right. And then Lupin Somerset. That's kind of state. Yeah. What is it? But it's not the city.
Yeah.
Sounds like it would be in England.
And there's also no picture. I mean, they
Or
don't give
contact
you,
information.
they don't give you much info. Oh, the about CRO. So here is where they say they're open access. Their copyright policy is very short. They do say that authors retain copyright, but there's no retraction or preservation policy mentioned. They clearly mention the fees, $550. So, I mean, journals vary, but so that can seem low to who you are, or that seems kind of high to me. And then another thing is if you wanted to take a look at other articles, if you go to their archive, things available for 2018. If you go to 2017, they have one issue in March and July. So, you know, they don't steadily publish, you know, well-established ones. They have an issue twice a month, once a week. And, you know, their archives are really easy to navigate. They were established in 2009. And then the other thing, besides just the journal itself, is the publisher. The publisher is called Academic Journals. That's such a vague name, like it's not like a Wiley or a Sage or something like that. They just list all their different journals. Oh, another thing about predatory publishing, they try to have a journal in every scope. So they'll have one on engineering, on different sciences, humanities. Oh, here they have browse by subject, and there's no space between the number and the topics. And then if you scroll to the bottom for the contact us, it's just a web form. There's no like information on this really at all. And you know, they have this open access Creative Commons picture, but Creative Commons, if you have a Creative Commons license, it's going to tell you what type of license it is, and then it's going to link to the Creative Commons to let you know what you can and can't do with the publication. You know, it's like CC by SA or CC by SA and C, you know, there's these little abbreviations.
So that's just graphic, that's not.
Yeah, oh, it might be a link. Oh, yeah. So it just links to here. But I mean, there's like a distinct badge telling you the specific type of license, and then that links to more detail on the license, letting you know what you can and can't do. That's everything. Yeah. So this is clearly a predatory journal. And I got the publisher from Bell's List to think of an example, and then I just went and grabbed a random journal. So this is also on Bell's List. It's not indexed in any well-known databases, so this is one you would want to steer clear